My name is Sai, and it's a real honor to be invited and to get to kick off the day with all of you. So I want to thank the organizers for bringing us all together and providing a space for debate and discussion in this way. I have to say that while thanking the organizers, I also feel a little bit like I've been thrown into the minefield of the first debate and a discussion which I think is complicated in this moment, and so I want to start with that, which I think it can seem perhaps it can raise questions, I think, of what the point is of having a discussion about how we relate to the axis of resistance at a time where on the one hand we're having this discussion in the midst of a genocide, an ongoing genocide, a genocide that shows no signs of abating anytime soon, and in a situation in which the axis of resistance has very often been the only set of organizations that have attempted to challenge that genocide with all the limitations and problems in their approach. And I think it's important for a couple of reasons. I think it's important, on the one hand, because I think talking about how we relate as socialists or how we think about the axis of resistance is a way for us to think about strategy. How do we think about a free Palestine? And in a sense, I think that's also what that meeting could have been called, which is how do we envision in the midst of the extraordinary horrors we've been seeing for the last 19 months, and in the midst of regional defeat that I think we will be with for a long time. I think we should think of the current moment alongside 1948 and 1967 as a moment of major advances, both for Israel's settler colonial project, for Western imperialism that it represents, and of defeat of the kind of alternatives that are available in the region, and a reality of defeat we have to reckon with. And I think thinking about how we relate to the axis of resistance is one of the ways in which we can start thinking about strategy and about the liberation of Palestine in the long term, despite this moment of defeat. So what is the axis of resistance? For those of you who don't know, I think it's useful to think of it as a regional alliance, both political and military, although we tend to focus on the military aspect of the axis of resistance, which is centered on Iran, but is certainly not reducible to it. And we can talk about that perhaps more in the discussion. It is united on the question of opposing the US-centered regional order in which both Israel and the GCC states play a central role. It is also perhaps, I didn't say, it can raise questions about why we discuss it now at a time of such deep defeat and weakness. And I think that's something we have to think about in terms of the discussion, is that the axis of resistance in September 2023 looked like it was at the height of its power. Iran's influence in the region was much wider than it had been for a very long time. Hezbollah was much more armed and appeared much more militarily prepared than it had been for a very long time. And 19 months later, I think we have to deal with the fact that the axis of resistance has certainly been defeated now and potentially defeated for a very long time to come. So why is this important for strategy? Why is it important to think about a free Palestine? And what am I going to try to argue today? My argument, and it's not a particularly original one, is that I think we have to think about the axis of resistance to both unconditional but critical support. And I'm going to try to explain why unconditional, why critical, and why we might want to think differently about what a liberated Palestine and a liberated region might look like. I think it's unconditional and critical both because of the situation the axis of resistance faces, as the people of the region face. I think unconditional and critical because of the reality of imperialism, and I do want to put kind of a gigantic asterisk on the critiques that I will discuss today, is that we can't disconnect them from the reality that every actor in the region has to engage with a US-centered world order to which the different organizations of the Axis respond to, and that Zionism, of course, is central to. but also unconditional and critical, because I think I want from the outset to make a difference between the membership of the different organizations that make up the axis of resistance and its leadership. And I think that's important because without it, I think it's very difficult to understand its real popularity in many of the different countries that we're talking about. So if you think about Hezbollah in Lebanon, it's impossible to understand its popularity and its strength without understanding the fact that Hezbollah is the only line of defense between effectively the entire south of the country and ongoing Israeli military aggression. And so I think it's absolutely crucial to critique the shortcomings and the mistakes of Hezbollah as an organization and of its leadership, while also recognizing that the reason it's able to mobilize, to recruit and to pull people into its organization is a real one. The fact that people need direct military defense against ongoing military assaults and colonization. I think that's also important to bear in mind, is that the situation is not only one of genocide in Palestine for the moment, it's also one in which Israel is making clear now in public that it is not planning to pull out either of Lebanon and Syria, that in Syria it's advancing its settler colonial project, that it's now openly talking about partitioning the country, that it's establishing military bases in both Lebanon and Syria, that it's establishing what it's calling euphemistically demilitarized zones of influence, and in which it's continuing to carry out continuous kind of military strikes against both the population and the organizations of the Axis. And that, I think, is the starting point of why we say uncritical, not that way around, unconditional but critical support. Why is it unconditional? It is unconditional because this is where we have to start. We have to start from the fact that these organizations emerge as a response to a situation of ongoing, over 100 years now, of Israeli settler colonialism that is encroaching on the countries of the region, a situation of imperialism in which the populations, not only of Palestine but of the region, are being targeted militarily, economically, diplomatically, politically by the most powerful states in the world. And that those populations are faced continuously with direct military assaults, occupation, oppression, settler colonial expansion. In that situation, no conversation can start without acknowledging and agreeing on the fact that populations living in that reality have a right to defend themselves, have a right to fight for their liberation, and that fight is not only that it is not only acceptable for that fight to take also a military form, but that it is necessary. Any demand of the Palestinian people or the people of the region to not mount military resistance against military invasion and occupation is a demand for the people of the region to die quietly. And so I don't think it's a point that we can start from. So any discussion, I think here we can have this discussion because I take as read that this is an accepted point of unity. I think in situations where it isn't, that is absolutely the point we have to start by defending, that there is an unconditional support for people living under settler colonialism, military invasion, occupation, to have the right to defend themselves and to defend themselves militarily. And we don't get a say about what organizational form that takes. The organizations that are able to emerge out of the historical moment and to take up that role are the organizations that will do it. They have the right to do it. We have to defend that right. And very often in the debates we have in the West, that's really the argument we're having. We don't really go further than that. And so it's the line we have to hold. We don't get to prevaricate on that question. People under military occupation, people under colonialism have a right to defend themselves, including militarily, and that resistance is absolutely central. Why then also talk about it being critical? And I think there's several aspects to that. The underlying aspect of it for me is that I think there is a difference between resistance and liberation. Is that on the one hand, we can talk about resistance. People need to be able to resist military occupation. On the other hand, I think as socialists, we also want to think about liberation. What does it look like to think about a liberated region? A region that is freed not only of imperialism, but also of the rule of its own ruling classes, of the different forms of oppression, of exploitation that continue to be a reality for the masses of the region as they are for us, and that cannot all be put at the door of imperialism. We can't as some of our comrades do, dissipate all the social contradictions that play themselves out in different countries by saying, well, imperialism is the central question, and later at some point down the line, maybe we'll talk about the lives of people, the violences, the exploitation, the oppression that they face. But as long as imperialism is present, we shouldn't talk about that. And in fact, what I'm going to try to say is that one of the reasons why the Axis cannot win is because of the social realities that it participates in maintaining and reproducing inside of the region. So you can't understand Hezbollah and Iran's inability, unwillingness, hesitation to respond to the 7th of October like the Palestinian resistance had imagined or hoped that it would, without understanding the real social, political, economic conflicts and tensions inside of Lebanon, inside of Syria, inside of Iran, that are the outcome of the policies of these regimes and that majorly undermine their own social basis and therefore their ability to fight back. And so I think actually we have to connect continuously the question of imperialism and the question of internal social relations to understand the real limitations in the strategy of the axis of resistance. So why critical? I mean, the first one I think is probably not really going to be a point of contention here, so I'm not going to spend a very long time on it. If it's a point of contention, I apologize and I'll come back to it in the discussion. But the organizations we are talking about, whether it's the Iranian or the Syrian regime, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's the Houthis in Yemen, whether it's Hamas or Islamic Jihad in Palestine, are deeply conservative organizations. If we were socialists living under their rule, we would be fighting them on questions of women's liberation, LGBT rights, trade union rights, our ability to organize as socialists sometimes. We would face them in social movements. They would send their organizations to batter us out of the streets when we mobilized, as in fact they do, and I will come back to this point. But so critical starts there immediately, is that I think to recognize the right of resistance is not to confuse resistance with liberation. And so that we always stand as socialists with the people who are fighting to move forward the liberation not only of the people of the region but of humanity as a whole. And that means standing with our allies in the women's movement, the LGBT movement, the labor movement, etc. Also when they fight those organizations, and not to sacrifice those organizations to a kind of imagined struggle, and I often think it is imagined, against imperialism that supposedly those organizations and those struggles would be undermining. I think there is something beyond the conservatism, and in fact, and I'm probably not going to have the time, but there is something perhaps useful for us to think about how different really the kind of current axis of resistance is from the Arab nationalist alliances in 1967, for example, or in the 1940s. Very different politics. The Arab nationalists were certainly rhetorically progressive. We can talk about what we actually think about that. But what they have in common is that they were trying to build political projects that were state-centric, and that while critical of the ongoing balance of forces in the region, are not proposing to fundamentally transform the social order of the region. What they are proposing is to strengthen their hand in the existing social relations. And I think we see that very directly in the ongoing conflicts between progressive movements and the different organizations of the axis of resistance. And I have to speed forward a little bit. So what do I mean by that? Let's take a couple of concrete examples. People might know that in Lebanon in 2019, a large social movement erupted that was part of a second wave of regional uprisings. So in the first wave, we had the revolutions in Egypt, Tunisia, Bahrain, Syria, Libya. Apologies if I forgot one of them. Yemen. Which were violently repressed by the different regimes of the region, including the Syrian regime, which is a sort of a central, or was a central part of the axis of resistance. And in 2019, you get a second round, particularly in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Sudan, and in Algeria. And at that time, one of the organizations that comes out to violently repress the movement in Lebanon is Hezbollah. Hezbollah sends its men into the streets to batter the demonstrations out of the streets and really fight against what the central message of that movement is, which is to say that they reject the kind of sectarian makeup of the country, that all the different leaders of the country are collectively responsible for impoverishing it, for privatizing its welfare state, for refusing to invest in the lives of people. And so Hezbollah is directly targeted as part of that movement because it participates in maintaining the sectarian order inside of Lebanon. And I think that's important. On the one hand, it defends the populations in the south, and that is real. It defends them militarily. But it also participates in maintaining a political reality in which it continues to be the only point of call for the poor populations of the south in the absence of a well-functioning Lebanese state. In Syria, I think the argument is more straightforward. The revolutions in the region immediately triggered massive demonstrations, massive strikes, an incredible revolutionary movement in Syria. And we've spoken very little about what that revolutionary movement achieved because we've spent much of our time arguing about whether or not that revolution should be supported because it was taking place against supposedly an ally of the resistance. The reality is that the Syrian people, in establishing the local coordination councils, for example, went the furthest from any of the people in the region and probably of any revolutionary movement in the 21st century in establishing alternative forms of governance and control over their everyday lives than any other social movement did. The fact that that revolution emerged against the Assad regime and the fact that it was crushed in the horrendous and kind of continuous way that it was for over a decade, I think tells us exactly about what this commitment to state power first and foremost and moving the existing balance of power rather than transforming the social realities in the region looks like. The question was how to defend the Syrian regime, its control over the state, and the kind of projection of power that comes with it against its own population. And in fact, we can also talk about Hezbollah's commitment to crushing that revolution as well in order to prevent its trade routes, particularly military trade routes with Iran, which brings us back to this question that if defending the state and defending power in the relations of inside of the social relations as they currently exist is your central political goal, you will continuously be brought into direct confrontation with anybody trying to transform that social reality fundamentally as the people of Syria were. In Iran, we can point to the Green Movement in 2009, to the Women, Life and Freedom movement in 2022 that repeatedly clashed against the Iranian government, not only over the questions as kind of liberal commentators like to focus on exclusively, of questions of women's liberation or democracy. It sounded like I was saying these aren't important. They're absolutely key, but it's not the only thing these movements were pointing to. They were also pointing to a fundamental reorganization of Iranian life and politics, and were violently repressed by the Iranian regime. I hope that in a meeting like this we can agree that as socialists we stand with mass movements that fight against their bosses, against their rulers, against their states, and that we do so not only out of a moral kind of conviction, but out of an analysis that there lies the agency for a fundamental reorganization, transformation of society, and we can talk about that more. The second reason, I think, while we talk about a critical support, is that I think we have to recognize the real limited ability of an effective military challenge to Israel. And I think that's something we have to recognize, is that to fight Israel in the region is not to fight Israel in the region. To fight Israel in the region is to fight the largest military powers in the world, primarily the United States, but also Britain, Germany, the Netherlands. I mean, we saw how much our own government fought its own courts to be allowed to continue to send military parts to maintain the Israeli fleet of F-35s in the middle of a genocide, right? And why? Because Israel is never about Israel. Israel is about maintaining a military base at the crossroads of three continents at the opening of the Suez Canal, at the gates of the region that contains the most oil and natural gas in the world, that is absolutely key for the functioning of the global capitalist economy, and that our own ruling classes will do absolutely everything, as we know and as we can see day after day, in order to maintain their control too. So to fight Israel is not to fight Israel. To fight Israel is to fight the United States, is to fight Britain, is to fight Europe. And we've seen that very directly in the context of the genocide. The moment Israel unleashed its genocide on Gaza, the United States, Britain, Germany, the Netherlands placed warships, spy planes, military troops in Cyprus, continued to send military aid, upped the amount of ammunitions and bombs that were being sent. Very famously, Haig, who was then Secretary of State in the 1970s of the United States, described Israel as an unsinkable aircraft carrier that could not be sunk and for which not a single American soldier needed to serve. That is what Israel is. Israel is a direct representation of Western military power in the region. So when other states in the region fight it, they are actually fighting the West collectively. And so the mismatch, the military mismatch, the mismatch in an imagined possible armament race is so big that I think it is a mistake to think that it is possible to imagine a military victory. And that doesn't mean that military confrontation wouldn't take part of it, but a military victory only of countries in the region that are united exactly on the basis that they live under the boot of Western power. It is because they live under the boot of Western power that they are united in different forms of alliances, whether it was Arab nationalism in the 1960s, whether it's the Axis of Resistance now. Their very subordinate role in the world economy, it's what brings them together in order to fight Western power. And so to think that out of that subordination a military victory can arise, I think is a mistake. I also think it's actually a misreading of previous anti-colonial movements, that we have majorly put the emphasis on military confrontation to understand the victory of liberation movements, for example, in the African continent against settler colonialism in North Africa, in East Africa, etc., in South Africa. And while military confrontation was an absolutely central part of it, I think we majorly underestimate the fact that those places were important economically to the world order, and that it's the loss of control over that economic resource, often through the mass mobilization of workers' movement, that forced the imperial backers of those colonies to pull out. And we can talk more about that in the discussion. I also think that this ability is majorly undermined by the state-centric logic of those states, which is to say that the Palestinian question is always useful as a rhetorical tool, talk about the Palestinians as an embodiment of the wider oppression of the region, but the Palestinians are also continuously a real wild card to the geopolitical calculations of the different states in the region. And so that the different uprisings of the Palestinians throughout history have put real question marks on the power plays of their so-called allies in the region. It is not for nothing that the Palestinians were defeated, for example, at the high point of the Palestinian revolution in the 70s and 80s in both Jordan and Lebanon, not only by imperialism, but by the very Arab regimes that were supposed to be their allies. It is the Assad regime that decides at the 11th hour not to support militarily the Palestinians in Jordan, which makes their massacre and their expulsion out of Jordan in Black September possible. It is the Assad regime that goes into the camps in Lebanon and massacres the Palestinian left because it is getting so close to really challenging state power inside of the region. And I think similarly, if we think about how hesitant, how unwilling both the Iranian regime and Hezbollah were in responding to the call of the Palestinian resistance after the 7th of October, has everything to do with their regional calculations. The Iranian regime was in a situation of normalizing relations with the GCC states. They had just signed a very important agreement under the leadership of China. The Iranian regime felt like it was able to come to an agreement on its nuclear program with the United States, and there could not have been a worse time for the Iranians, and in purely geopolitical calculations, they probably were right, for the Palestinians to launch a major wave of resistance in that moment. And so they were majorly unwilling to participate, and Hezbollah did a sort of a polite back and forth with Israel in the north, but really for the first kind of year and a half until Israel invades southern Lebanon, apart from the Houthis in Yemen, the axis of resistance is extremely withheld in terms of the support that it is prepared to give to the Palestinians. And I think we have to understand that as its commitment to state power and to strengthening its hand in the existing social order in the region rather than transforming the social order in the region. And the Palestinians have always been a challenge to that vision, not least because they don't have a state. It's one of the reasons, I really don't have time, but why Oslo is such a terrible reactionary step backwards, is that the Palestinian struggle always pointed to the possibility of reimagining the region outside of the imposed limits of the nation states in the region, and something which both the Arab nationalist regimes and Axis today reject. Very briefly, because I'm doing appallingly for time, what I think is important is to say that there is a connection between both of those things I mentioned. There is a connection, and I've already started talking about it, between being critical because of what the political project of the organizations of the Axis is within those countries themselves, and the fact that they are unwilling, unprepared to generate a real challenge to the social order in the region. It is the commitment of these organizations to state power, to strengthening their hand in the existing status quo, that leads them continuously to see mobilizations from below as a threat to their own political project. It's destabilizing, it's uncontrollable, it raises demands they don't agree with, it tries to push much further, it challenges their own power, their own economic control, their own political control, and so repeatedly leads to these organizations crushing mass popular resistance. Like I mentioned, it is also because of the repeated moves by those organizations to crush popular resistance within their own borders that by the 7th of October they were totally unable to mobilize sufficient social support at home to be able to act in any significant way against Israel. Hezbollah, the Syrian regime, Iran were terrified of what any long-running military confrontation with Israel would mean for the social reality inside of their own countries. They already existed on borrowed time. They were already in a situation of major unpopularity. Hezbollah was not the Hezbollah of 2006, right? It was already majorly unpopular because of what it did in 2019, because of what it did in Syria. It was dealing with major internal political and economic questions, and therefore felt that if its actions were seen as triggering a larger conflict with Israel, it would majorly sap the already very weak social position they were in. The same was true for the Syrian regime and the Iranian regime, and history has sort of proven them right. So it's again, I'm not saying that they're wrong. What I'm saying is their political project is limited to maintaining state power and or gaining state power. And if that's the political project, then any kind of development that tries to push the envelope and raise the banner of liberation becomes a direct threat to maintaining that state power. Very briefly, before the chair physically wrestles me to the floor, is that I think we then have to ask what our alternative is. Because on the one hand, the Palestinian left from the 1960s onwards has been very clear on the fact that the liberation of Palestine will not come from Palestine alone. That both the internal social realities in Palestine, the Palestinians are excluded from the center of the Israeli economy, the Israeli working class, I hope we're not having that argument here today, but is deeply committed to the colonial project. I mean, if we need to have that argument, I'll have it, but is deeply committed to the colonial project. There is no real agent inside of the borders of historic Palestine that is able to alone defeat the Israeli state. And so the Palestinian left has always talked about the need to think about a regional project, not only because of the balance of forces, but also because of what Zionism is, which is what I was saying before. Zionism is a regional project. It's not only a colonial project in historic Palestine, it's a regional project of maintaining Western power at a crucial nodal point of the world economy. And therefore the Palestinian left always looked to the wider region. And unlike the politics of the axis of resistance, or unlike the politics of Arab nationalism before it, the most radical elements of the Palestinian left raised the question that the only thing that could bring imperialism to its knees was to fundamentally challenge not the balance of powers in the region, but the social order of the region altogether. That why is Israel useful for imperialism? Israel is useful for imperialism because it disciplines the region as a whole, as we are seeing for the moment, and anytime somebody steps out of line, Israel is there to knock them back. And so what the Palestinian left theorized was that the revolutionary movements of the region, the mass movements by workers, by the poor, by peasants at the time, less today, that would challenge capitalist social relations, that would challenge state power, that would challenge the local ruling classes, which famously Hassan Kanafani theorized as part of the enemy trinity that Palestinians faced: the Palestinian elites, the reactionary Arab regimes, and imperialism. That by challenging their power, the regional revolutionary movements would not only challenge their own rulers, but they would also put a very stark strategic question at the door of Western imperialism. And that question was, at what point does Israel stop being an asset and does it become a danger, or it starts undermining Western power in the region? And in my last 30 seconds, we got a small glimpse of that in 2011. And I think even without going all the way to think about socialist transformation, of course socialist transformation would fundamentally put question marks on Western imperialism, but I think we don't even have to think that far. In 2011, the revolutionary movements of the region, as revolutionary movements in the region have done repeatedly, made in a very direct and organic way the connection between their own liberation and the liberation of the Palestinians. Nowhere did millions of people hit the streets of the region demanding the fall of their regime without also raising the Palestinian flag and the question of Palestinian liberation, even within the so-called countries of the axis of resistance. People understood very famously the slogan in Syria, you know, that not one bullet, not one bomb had been shot to liberate the Golan Heights, for example, which is Syria, it's not even historic Palestine. But so that demand was continuously raised. And why is that important? Because I think it points to the fact that even just democratization in the region, let alone a fundamental transformation of the social order, would put on the table a very difficult question for Western imperialism, which is to say, do you maintain your relations with countries in a region that is strategically key for the world economy, and that you are then forced to do it on a foot of equality, because you have to do it with regimes that are actually going to represent the will of their people, including on the Palestinian question? Or do you continue to support a military state that is going to build the pressure of the state against you? And of course, I think, and that's where I don't think we get to sidestep the question of military power also, but not military power alone. In the first instance, of course, Israel would be mobilized as a military bulwark to try to crush any revolutionary movement that might come close, even to such a limited goal as real democratization in the region. But military alone doesn't get you to that point. The military power is necessary to protect the victories of the revolution, which is also how the Palestinians talked about it in the 70s, by the way, that military power was to protect the advances of the revolution. But the revolution itself is what can challenge the balance of forces in the region, the social order in the region, and can put on the table that if anybody wants to be present in the region, it needs to do so in a situation where there is a free Palestine. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.